Public Policy Public Lecture Series. It's actually the second, no, it's the third or fourth of this year, and we're almost reached the number of 10 since we started the school last year. The objective of the lecture series is to bring distinguished statesmen, practitioners, academics, opinion makers to AUC events to speak about issues of concern to the community here in Egypt, new trends that are happening globally with a particular focus on issues of public policy and global affairs. Today, it is a real personal pleasure to be able to welcome to the AUC campus, to this event, and to a Gap School event in particular, two very distinguished practitioners who are very knowledgeable on the subject at hand. We've decided to focus today on issues of Euro-Med relations and particularly freedom of movement, but not exclusively on that issue. And of course, the speakers have a free hand to intermingle this issue with anything else that they want to present to this audience who will benefit from all their insights. Our panelists today are Ambassador Nehad Abdel Latif, Chair of the National Steering Bureau of the Egyptian-European Union Bilateral Relations with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Ambassador Marc Franco, the European Union Ambassador to Egypt. I will just say a few words about each of them, and then start the discussion immediately. If you don't mind, I will start the discussion in the same sequence as I read out their names, unless you want to debate that and negotiate who to speak first. Anyway,
it's easier for you to type again.
Ambassador Abdel Latif is a very close person, friend of mine, who has a tremendous experience at the Foreign Ministry. He was my senior colleague at the Ministry for years. We worked closely together with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was also the ambassador in Italy. Was Assistant Minister of State for Economic Affairs, Technical Cooperation, Economic Affairs. And then was also Secretary General of the Egyptian Fund for Technical Cooperation in Africa. I'm just mentioning the top part of his career. He also was a member of the Egyptian mission and embassies in Bulgaria, Sweden, Chile, and France. And frankly, he is one of the most interesting professionals at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that I've met in 30 years of service. And I welcome him both in my professional capacity, my academic capacity, but also my personal capacity. And really welcome to
Thank you very much.
Ambassador Franco represents, of course, the European Union, and for many different reasons, be they historic, economic, social, or simply reasons of proximity, he represents a group of countries that are very important to Egypt, very important to the Arab world, very important to the southern Mediterranean, or above the fact being very important on a global level. So he comes to us with again, a very extensive experience and a tremendous amount of knowledge on the issues that are important to us. Originally, he is he remains, of course, of Belgian nationality. He has a master's degree in economics. He has also represented the European Union in Moscow, has had a academic experience as well as a professional practitioner experience, being a researcher at Cambridge University and working on many different issues from West Africa for United Nations and a professor at the university in Belgium. What I'd like to do is ask Ambassador Latif to start first with a few words on the subject, then we'll have Ambassador Franco talk, and then maybe we will have either a discussion between them or we'll open it up to the floor. And of course, ambassadors, you can speak either from the table or from the podium, whatever you're more comfortable with.
Thank you very much. I have 10 minutes or less.
10 minutes.
I won't interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, yes, the most important action. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting us this
conference is dealing with an important issue for Egypt and for the EU. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to visit the first time, not to visit, but at least to get acquainted with the AUC in our coming. Of course, AUC in Cairo. I've been there many times, but this is my first time. And really, I'm very much impressed, and I'm jealous that the students have such stimulating environment. Really, it's very stimulating for the students to study and to have this very friendly atmosphere. The lecture or the conference is about Euro-Med relations and in particular freedom of movement. So I'll give a glance about Euro-Med relations, just in few words, that Euro-Med relations, or we call it partnership, a term which has been for the first time, and Mark will correct me, in 1995. With the launching of the Barcelona process in Barcelona. Before that, it was mainly the Mediterranean, of course, has been always one of the most important areas that the EU and the European communities before as an important partner. But it was a Mediterranean policy of the European Union. It was not a Euro-Med partnership or built by both of them. So they had the Mediterranean policy, a large Mediterranean policy, a strengthening Mediterranean policy, but for the first time the two sides of the Mediterranean sat together and formulated or elaborated a joint declaration of principles and a working program. And that was very important. That gives a beginning of what we can call a co-ownership or joint ownership, because as I said before, documents were only drafted and by the European Union as such, but this one, it was a joint endeavor, a joint effort, and it was at the beginning of a process that lasted till now in 2010. So this Euro-Mediterranean partnership encompasses three main baskets. This is the security political basket, economic and financial basket, and the human and cultural dimension or baskets. In 2008, there was a new development in this Euro-Med partnership with the establishment of what we call the Union for the Mediterranean. The Union for the Mediterranean has an added value in two aspects. One is to deepen this co-ownership or joint ownership. What does it mean? That means the establishment of joint, a co-presidency, a secretariat, a joint committee in Brussels to follow up. And this was for the first time implemented in such a way. The concept itself has evolved from the previous version, but it was built on what we call the Barcelona acquis. The second added value is the Union will concentrate more on projects that will contribute to the socio-economic development of the whole area. Number three, it is not limited only to the members of the Barcelona process. That means the 27 members of the European Union plus 11 members of the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean, but also it involved new members in the Balkan or Western Balkan and Monaco, and so there are now 43 instead of being 38 or something like that. So this is the third aspect that is most new. But in general, projects and co-ownership. Projects, there were priority areas, 6 priority areas that have been identified in order to try to work together in implementing such major legislation. Most important is to make really, the partnership visible and have an impact on the population and the peoples of the region. So this is the developments from Euro and Barcelona to the Union for the Mediterranean. It covers, as I said, 6 areas of priorities, but it goes beyond that. It covers everything. It covers
economic development, social affairs, what they call in the European Union justice alone, but it means migration. Migration was also, here it comes related more or less, but not exactly, with the freedom of movement of facilitating the legal movement of persons. Migration and facilitation of the movement of people, of persons in Barcelona 95 was not really a matter or a priority. It was only mentioned in the third basket, in the social and human basket, but it was not really given all the importance it should have been given to it. But in 2005, migration and facilitation of movement was what we can consider a fourth basket. It was three main baskets listed there, plus this basket of migration and facilitation. Of course, for us or for me, to facilitate the movement of persons is not directly related to migration. Migration is an issue where we have legal migration, we have illegal migration, and we have migration and development. Facilitate the movement of freedom is not an easy issue to discuss with the European Union. It is still a problematic issue that has to be discussed and negotiated very intensely, as I said. And it reflects in general the EU position concerning the freedom of movement. Within the WTO, it's a mode for that we can accept the freedom, of course, of capital and goods, but the freedom of people, of persons, of the natural persons that are dealing with these issues is limited. There are security concerns, but there are also difficulties in the visa procedures and how to make, in spite of this is a very important issue that we build confidence, build mutual understanding between the peoples around the Mediterranean. So we are trying, I remember in 2005 when we were in Barcelona, to write in the declaration, in the working program, because there was no declaration at the time, but the working program to reach, a sentence in the working document was very difficult, extremely difficult. It was easier, much easier, we reached an understanding, so that the two sides accepted the compromise language, which is to work towards facilitation. So it is a difficult issue. Today, it is not as difficult as before. There is an opening from the EU to discuss, to consider how to facilitate the legal movement of people. And recently, the European Commission issued a document on taking stock of the progress of the action plans in the neighborhood policy, and they recognize that this is an issue that should be considered in a deeper way in order really to bridge or to make a bridge among the peoples of the And it has been so. What I was on to say that migration is one issue, and to facilitate the movement of persons is another issue. They are linked, because in order to facilitate the movement, there should be a mutual understanding between the two sides of the Mediterranean. To add here, concerning the EU-Med relations, is not only now within the Union for the Mediterranean or with the Barcelona process as it was called before. There is a new policy from the European Union called the neighborhood policy. Well, here there is a change in the centrality of the protagonist of this relationship. It means that the Euromed and the Union for the Mediterranean, the center of gravity is the Mediterranean. In the European neighborhood policy, it is Europe the center of gravity. That's why for us, they should complement each other. And within this neighborhood policy, we have bilateral action plans with different countries. And here again, the issue of facilitating the movement of the freedom of the movement of people, the legal movement, not misunderstood, of people is again an issue that is always identified and discussed between us. Because for us, we cannot understand this increase and diversification of our religions in all areas, and we have without having this facilitation. Because when we talk about facilitated movements, it's not to go there for long stay and to be to respond to the concerns of the Europeans that every state they will not come back and they will become illegal migrants. So what we are saying is, for instance, when we do business and people want to increase business, and if there are problems or if there are obstacles in obtaining a visa, this is, I mean, it doesn't help or it doesn't correspond to the spirit of the partnership that both of us we are keen to achieve together. So I think there is room and space to improve it, and we are sure that the European partners with the visa codes are trying to improve the procedures and researchers, mobility, here of course mobility and facilitating our work that we can not use it alternatively, but there is also this link between what we call mobility and facilitate the movement of people. We are talking about researchers, academicians, we are talking about different categories that they are not planning to migrate to Europe. They are not planning to stay there illegally. So that's why if we can differentiate or distinguish between categories of short-term visas and how to easier, how to have simplified, accelerating, that makes people go around easier, and because this will help your understanding if you consider that the movement of people is really an instrument of bridging the gap between the two sides, concerning the cultural side, concerning all aspects of human relations among the protagonist of this relationship. This in general, just a few thoughts or fruitful thoughts. We can elaborate, of course, on all the issues I didn't mention. I didn't talk about trade, I didn't talk about transport, energy, and other priorities in the Euro-Med relation. Sorry, I didn't exceed the minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Nehad. Thank you very much. Why don't I invite Pastor Franco to make his comments first, and then we'll open it up for a discussion between them and with the floor as well.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this debate on this very important topic, and arguably one of the most difficult topics we can talk about, because it's a difficult topic inside the European Union as well as a difficult topic in relations between the European Union and certain countries. Because most of the time when we speak in the European Union, we speak about goods and trade and trading goods and services and capital movements and financial markets, and these topics are really difficult, but when you start talking about the people, it becomes much more difficult, because you talk about persons and their families, you talk about collectivities, you talk about employment, unemployment, all these topics come up, and they of course are much more difficult to deal with, because they they touch directly the people concerned. Inside the European Union, as you know, we have this what we call the four freedoms, the single market with the four freedoms: the freedom of movement of goods, the freedom of movement of services, of capital, and of labor. And arguably, the last issue, freedom of movement of labor, was at least, and still is, the most difficult to realize fully, because there still remain hindrances to movements of people and new movement of labor within the European Union. Of course, the general rules, the general framework for this freedom has been defined, but difficulties remain. For instance, if you look at the question of new member states, most of the transition periods for application of European legislation are related to the movement of people. And we had, with the last alignment, of course, even some of the most liberal countries in this respect, like the UK, did have severe difficulties on its labour market, particularly in the city of London. And the recent events in France with the Romas also indicate that within the European Union, all these problems related to free movement of people are not really solved. So it is not therefore amazing that in its relation with third countries, it is also a problem that is not easy to solve. We have about 20 million migrants, I mean, that mean people from outside the European Union living in the European Union. Many of them come from the South Mediterranean countries and from African countries. The situation in each of our countries in the European Union is different because of historical reasons, social reasons. I mean, it's very difficult to compare them. Because of, as I said, history and also the immigration policies of the various countries. And therefore, it has taken a time before we got around defining a European Union migration policy. Now, before I come to that, let me nevertheless make a distinction between two aspects that also Ambassador Abdel Latif has indicated. One issue is visas, and the other issue is the issue of economic migration. I will leave political asylum for the moment outside the scope because that's a totally different, well, not totally different, but another type of discussion. On visa policy, yes, there is a European Union policy for short-term visas. I mean, Schengen concerns not long-term, but short-term visas. And that has been in operation now for something like 10 years. Most of the European Union countries and some non-member states participate in the scheme. As you know, it allows people to move freely in a very big zone. Practically, I mean, the whole European Union, with the exception of UK and Ireland, and a number of countries are still in the transition phase. It has been a successful scheme, but also non-EU countries like Switzerland, Norway, Iceland have adhered to it. There is in 2009 a new visa code, which has allowed us to further simplify and harmonize regulations. It is in operation now, and it rules. It is the basic regulation for the short-term visa policy in the European Union, also applicable to Egypt. With this application of visas, there have been difficulties, not just in Egypt, in many countries, because the facilities for traveling inside the Union are very great. There's a lot of flexibility of where you go, where you can go. The moment you get into one country, you can't freely travel to all the other countries. There are no checks at the border, and you travel legally to the whole European Union almost. So therefore, the conditions for awarding the visas are more strict, and the rules that are applied are, and this is one of the problems, sometimes applied in a different manner or with different accents by various countries. Now, together with the colleagues from the consulates, we're working very hard now to understand better what exactly is happening and how the whole system operates, so that we can see what can we learn from each other, can we further simplify, harmonize, streamline the procedure so that some of the difficulties that we know at this moment could be avoided. And we have made a proposal to Ambassador Abdel Latif for the travel of officials to Brussels in particular, and I hope we can have a discussion soon, because I think it would already facilitate an important part of the problem. Economic migration is another story, because this is more linked to labor market, to the labor market in the countries from which the people migrate from, and the labor market in the countries where they arrive. We have seen an upsurge of economic migration in Western Europe in the 60s and 70s in the process of economic growth. The labor market needed additional elements, so many laborers from Africa joined, and Turkey joined the European labor market. Unfortunately, afterwards, in the second half of the 70s, the economic growth slowed down, The labor market became narrower, but flows continued for a while, and also, of course, this migration ended up in second and third generation of migrants. So we had a larger number of non-European population in our countries. As I said before, something like 20 million at this moment. And one cannot say that the exercise of integration in all countries of the European Union has been successful. Some countries are more successful than others in integrating the flow of foreigners that came to work in the countries of the European Union. There was a large number of people that came in a fairly short period. It hit a period of economic stagnation, but created tension on the labor market. And what also created a problem in many countries is the difference of culture from those people that migrated and into the societies where they migrated into. And it is, of course, a difficult problem in all countries of the world. And again, some of the member states have been better in having an integration policy than others. It had ended up, indeed, in, let's say, social and economic tension. In some of our member states, it was clear that we had to, for European policy, that no longer the individual national policies in migration were sufficient. 2005, a European Union policy on migration has been formulated. It's based on three pillars, fairly obvious. First one is facilitation and regularization of legal migration. The second one is curbing illegal migration in cooperation with the countries where the migrants come from. And the third pillar of this approach is the link between migration and development. That means creating job opportunities in those countries where people migrate from in order for them to allow to build up a decent standard of living in their own country, avoiding for them that they have to move to the European Union. And this is, I guess, in the benefit of both sides. In the context of the Euromed relations, of course, we have translated this policy in a number of particular programs, cooperation programs. I can mention the Euromed migration. No. Euromed migration. With a budget of 5 million. It's part of a wider program on the justice and home affairs sector that has been approved in 2006, and it comprises two other regional programs in that area. And the project will set up mechanisms, working groups, training sessions on the job study visits to combat illegal migration in the Euro-Mediterranean region. The second project that I want to mention and that we have launched earlier this year in Egypt is a project together with the United Nations Joint Migration and Development Initiative. It's a 15 million program for 3 years funded by European Union funds through the thematic program for cooperation with third countries in the areas of migration and asylum. And it has a number of components on skill transfer in aquaculture and fisheries. This is cooperation with Greece, sustainability in development project. This is a cooperation between Egypt and Cyprus, and a project on entrepreneurial knowledge, and this is cooperation between Egypt and Germany. There are a number of initiatives that have been taken, probably not enough to cope with the, the gravity of the problem. That being said, Egypt is not, as far as the European Union is concerned, the most crucial country. As you know, most of the migration out of Egypt goes to Saudi Arabia, here Saudi Arabia, Libya, United States, and then comes Gaza, a number of other degrees at the end. So the flow, there are about I think 25,000 migrants in Italy every year, 2,000 in the UK and France, and 1,000 in Germany. So they're relatively small amounts. So as far as the European Union is concerned, Egypt is not a crucial country in terms of this migration relationship, but of course other Mediterranean countries, I'm thinking of Morocco or of Turkey, are much more important in terms of numbers. I think it is important that we're building up this policy. We have the policy that dates back to 2005. We had a conference, I think in Tampere in 2007, the ministerial conference, where this issue on the Euro-Mediterranean side was discussed. We are developing a number of projects and programs of cooperation. It's certainly that it's in our both interests that we step up and reinforce this cooperation because it's crucial for the European Union as well as for the countries where we find these countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. I mean, when you have a diplomat listening to two ambassadors, you tend to sort of get a sense of when you're being diplomatic and when you're not being diplomatic. And I want to sort of start off the discussion by not being diplomatic. Both of you talk about the Euro-Med relationship. And just by the way it's structured, one assumes that Euro-Med is moving together or towards each other into something that is more significant than what existed in years past when relations were bilateral between each one of our countries and so on and so forth. And it would also, I think, not be correct to assume that if you have what you call a Euro-Med relationship, that both sides would assume that there's more in it for them in that relationship than relationship between them and some other groupings of countries. Not necessarily everyone, but some other groupings of countries. Now, in listening to your comments, Ambassador Latif, who was diplomatic, seemed to be inferring that there is a problem with freedom of movement, including legal freedom of movement, including short-term legal movement, but not exclusively of that. Marc Franco seemed to be inferring that there are a couple of procedures that are moving forward in the short term, and that the long-term problems relate to economic realities. When things were going well, it was more liberal. When things are going becoming more difficult, it's becoming tighter, not only with the Mediterranean countries, but even with among European countries. Well, all of that may be true, but I'd really like to invite you, if not immediately in response to me, but later on in response to the questions, to be a bit more specific. I'll just throw out some examples. In the short term, given that we have a Euro-Med relationship, is the Schengen operation being applied better, more flexibly, easier with Mediterranean countries than with countries that Europe does not have a relationship with that is equivalent to a Euro-Med relationship? Secondly, how can you keep shifting, if you want, the long-term concepts for visas every time there is a shift in economic trends without taking into account the human dimension of it? When you start encouraging migration in one direction, and ultimately it may occur in the other direction as well, you develop synergies, or you should develop synergies and responsibilities vis-a-vis the migrants in your own countries who are serving you as well as serving themselves, and which will have relationships with their national countries so often. So it's sort of turn it on, turn it off seems to be a bit of if a economically sound policy, I'm not sure it's a socially sound policy, or one that is consistent with two parties that believe that there is a strategic or at least a very important relationship between them, more so than with some other countries. But I also want to throw a question out, frankly, to Ambassador Latif. we have repeatedly heard complaints by the Southern Mediterranean side of this discussion on the issues of visas. And I know them all by heart, so I won't ask you about them. But what can we do better? Is there something that, as Southern Mediterranean, we need to do better to make the Europeans, or create more incentives for the Europeans to look at this issue from a different perspective? I mean, how can we sort of add to the relationship in a more positive sense? Why don't we start with those sort of points, and of course, if you want to comment about each other's comments, you can go ahead and do that, and then we will open it up to the floor also for questions.
Thank you very much. Of course, thank you. When I had my introduction remarks, I dealt with one aspect with the short term. So I wanted to wait for Marc to say about the labor migration, economic migration, in order to make this to try to reflect on what he is saying. Migration, legal migration, and employment. The last few years, coming this year, that the interlink between both of them is increasing there. We have here both of them in one sentence, one of the EU-Med's documents. Facilitate legal union as one of the key elements of our cooperation through promoting legal migration opportunities. So here it is the link between facilitating the legal movement and the legal migration. Legal migration opportunities is the most important instrument to combat illegal migration in our situation. And here we find that there is neighbors, always relation between neighbors is not very easy in general. You might have relations with non-neighbors. It's like we have neighbors, we have neighbors here and there. So it is sometimes sensitive issues between between neighbors. What I think, feel that we have looked. I mean, the European Union is looking to the southern Mediterranean country or the region, the southern eastern, as a zone of risk, of threats, not as much as a region of opportunities. Of course, we talk about taking peace together and prosperity and security and stability. And this is when we talk about the Barcelona process. When I said that for the first time, all sides are working together to build such station. And this was the first time. This is what I didn't say about structures. I didn't say about programs. This was the first time that we are trying together to build this space of Europe. As I said before, there was no European policy of the European Union. And when we talk about labor or employment and migration, there is a link with the facilitation of the freedom. I remember that in 2004, the first document of the Commission concerning this new labor policy, the four freedoms were there as incentives. On the second document which was adopted by the Council, this fourth freedom disappeared completely. Of course, we understand, and he said that this among member states, there is a problem. And that the problem comes with us here, because it reflects us. They came out with concerning the migration, and what we say, we are telling the Europeans, all right, you have an aging society, you have needs. But if you consider the people coming from the southern Mediterranean a threat from risk for you, and culturally they are different, and they are not integrating themselves enough in the societies of the European societies, let's sit and see how can we deal with and address the problem. Because we are in need, and we are ready, and we have also the potential to contribute, as other countries like Algeria contributed to the economic development of France or other countries and so on. And like Egyptians also in Italy, they are recognized that they are contributing in the development of the society, of course according to the numbers and so on. But is it possible to look at the legal migration and facilitating the movement of workers, like we did in Italy. In Italy, we have good examples of the link between the labor, what we call the labor migrants. There is, for instance, with Italy, a quota, annual settlement of 600 Egyptians that would go legally and have free movement during their stay. It's not that they would not be permanent, because Europe doesn't accept, I'm correct, this permanent member, migrants, like the last time. It is for not short term, but maybe medium term, but not for permanent migrants. I mean, it is not in their concept. So facilitating the movement here is the other coin of the visa Schengen, but this is concerning labor, economic migration, and labor opportunities. And for instance, we have here, I mean, one of the most important results of this meeting is to set up a working group on the migration aspects of the labor market. This has not been implemented. Yes, this program deals with migration, for instance, serious, but this is what the most important for us, that we sit together, and the vision here is to see labor opportunities of the European side. What can we fulfill from the southern European side to satisfy these needs? And the link between migration and development could be here confirmed or underscored, that it's not only remittances, because the main thing in the language of the European Union, they have to use better and safer the remittances, but it's not enough for development. It is what has been mentioned, is the professional training, is the capacity building, developmental projects that could even satisfy the needs. That's what's done in the Italy. They are having different centers where they train the labor, the manpower that they are needed to be ready. So here we have the two sides of the part. One, the short-term, and these are procedures, and the labor economic part. How can we do better in order to remove or to dilute concerns of the Europeans is to cooperate with them, and which is done, to combat illegal migration. First of all, that when we have problems, or when there are cases of illegal migration, to cooperate in the return of the illegal migrants. And this should dissipate a substantial part of their concerns. And again, here Italy is another example. I mean, we signed 5 years ago on the admission, and the number decreased. So that means that the order of country operation, in order to give credibility to the legal labor migrants, they are cooperating in such, because this is one of the concerns of the European side. So this is what should make them more comfortable in facilitating, simplifying, accelerating the issue of visas. The procedure is short. This is what I can say.
Thank you, Mr. Franco.
Okay. First on Schengen. Yes, there are third countries that, or nationals of third countries that can travel just with their passports in the European Union. And there is a list of these countries, and it's visa-free. And then there is those that need a Schengen visa to come in. Among those that need a Schengen visa to come in, there are those countries with whom we have negotiated or are negotiating what's called the visa facilitation agreement. That doesn't do away with the visa, but it solves the problem of a group of people that Ambassador Abdel Latif already mentioned, those people that travel frequently for professional reasons, like businessmen, journalists, academics. And visa facilitation consists in making it easier to have a 1-year or 2-year multi-entry visa. The procedure for obtaining this are easier. In the case of the South Mediterranean, we are in the category, non-visa facilitation, we are in fact in the category of the full application of the Schengen requirements. And as I was said before, within the rules that exist between the procedures that have to be followed, with our colleagues in the consulates, we're looking at how we can make it easier and quicker to deliver their the visas. Let me just again underline that there is not, and there should not be a link between a Schengen visa and economic migration, because if that's the case, then it's illegal. When you come in with a Schengen visa, you're not supposed to work on a permanent basis. You can come in as a businessman, you can literally have to disappear. You cannot work on a permanent basis. So this is one of the reasons why on the Schengen side there is some restrictiveness in getting visas. Not for the businessman that will travel, and that's why we should look for some facilitation. But for those people that with the Schengen visa get in and overstay their time limit and become illegal migrants with all complications and difficulties afterwards. So this is, I think, an issue that we should look at, how we can facilitate for short-term Schengen visas to travel to those people that need to travel for professional and other reasons and need to travel. And on the other hand, how we can still maintain the kind of control over what is the case. I mean, what is the scope of the economic long-term migration that on both sides we can accept. The second remark you made about the shifting economic situation, I think this is indeed the crux of the problem. This is the core of the problem, and this is why. I mean, as I said before, some of the member states have been better than others. My own country, Belgium, let me talk about that because I'm on the same ground, has not been particularly good in this. And we have totally overlooked this aspect. We just have taken it, and in the beginning it was very easy, and after a while you get stuck with second and third generation migration, which is a totally different nature than the first generation one, and that is very difficult to tackle. The fact that in Belgium, what is it now, 15 years ago, started a right-wing movement which was called Vlaams Blok at the time, which is nothing to do with Flemish, but just to do with the fact that they had anti-migration, they xenophobic, they want to migrate south, and so on and so forth, is due to the fact that we have in society very badly been coping with it, and that you had, in some cases, concentrations in Brussels or in Antwerp, my own city, that had difficult relationship with the autochthonous population. In fact, it's not as bad as that, because I mean, I myself live in Antwerp, but I live in a neighborhood which I guess is about 60% non-ethnic Belgian. It's most North Africa, those ones are both, and I enjoy the colorful landscape there. And there are not that many problems, but it is always a danger that something flares up, especially around the second and the third generation migration, because you're talking about the shifting economic conditions. It doesn't only apply on new people coming in, it also applies to those people that are there and have children. And this is a kind of a supply and a demand problem. Many of the second and third generation migrants, particularly boys, particularly men, they don't want to study. They go to back school, they don't finish it, they get out with a diploma, and of course they don't find jobs in the labor market. I mean, I'm generalizing, that's not for everybody, but it's kind of the bulk of the people. So they hang around, play basketball, drink tea, and talk about many, many topics, perhaps even some dangerous ones. Amazingly enough, it's different, but Karen Madeline will say that it is different, that it is not natural. The situation for women is different. The girls see this as a kind of an opportunity for social promotion. They go to school, they finish their degree, they go to university, and they get jobs. They get jobs in the supermarket, but they also get jobs as nurses, as doctors, as lawyers, and in the city council. It's a very strange phenomenon, and I wonder sometimes what it will do to this migrant societies in Belgium itself. I mean, it's a bit of another problem. It touches the shifting economic situation, where on the labor market, particularly as far as men is concerned, there is an insufficient preparation for entry to the labor market. On the other side, it is true that in surveys among employers, it also is revealed that there is a reluctance of employers to hire migrant labor, especially second and third generation, because they feel. I mean, I'm simplifying again a little bit, but it is a very difficult problem to solve. And in a sense, it is hard to say, but it can only be solved when we have a kind of stabilization of the population and not too many new entrants. Because new entrants will create additional problems. The reason why we have recently seen in Western Europe a kind of an increase in popularity of right-wing xenophobic parties is linked to that. It puts the government also in a position that they can no longer be very liberal and have more migrants in. So the governments are also forced, to stop almost. Perhaps it's not the best way of stopping it. I'm not a politician, I cannot judge it, but it is a difficult choice. Do you remain open and do you remain open to migrants coming in with a risk that there's a further deterioration of the situation also on the political side, or do you take measures that in fact are in line with what these radical right-wing parties are asking for and stop the migration? It's a kind of a political dilemma that we are facing at this moment in many of our countries. In Belgium, it's now a little bit less than it was because we had our crisis before, but there are a number of countries that are facing this crisis. It is socio-economic conditions and at the same time worsening political situation because of this tension that has not been fully integrated and absorbed by the society.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're going to do something different this time because one of our speakers at least is pressed for time. Ambassador Franco has to leave in a few minutes, so what I'd like to do is ask 2 or 3 questions just for the ambassador directly, and I'll have him answer them directly, and then we'll take advantage of Ambassador Latif to answer some of the questions. So you're always there. Okay. Any questions for Ambassador Franco? Okay, great.
Thank you very much, Mr. Franco. I will start with Mr. Franco since Latif is here. I would like to make some comments on what you said. I think that Ambassador Franco talked about shifting economic conditions, but there is a long-term reality. There is a short-term shift in reality, but there's a long-term reality. Ambassador Latif has talked about the major labor needs that Europe has in the future. I think the real dilemma is between these long-term needs and the political discourse. And the political discourse prevents, in fact, European countries from adapting to policy. And I think the real challenge is to have a political discourse which enables European countries to implement the principles that at times are followed. So I think, for instance, that the principles of the European approach to migration 2005 are fine. Frankly, I think they're fine. And the objectives of the Lisbon strategy. So this is about employment. So how do you really reconcile these contradictions between your objectives to achieve competitiveness on the one hand, and then restrictions on the other hand? Demand for highly skilled migrant labor, but there's also demand for low-skilled migrant labor. You want to combat irregular migration, but you need the informal sectors in Greece and Italy as they are, which attract irregular migration. So there are really contradictions there, and I think it would be good to face up to that. To face up to that, of course, I recognize that yes, there are problems even within Europe, but I think that this should not prevent the consideration of long-term objectives and the possibility of the political system not facing crisis at all point because it cannot adapt the policies restricted as they are by the discourse. So I have another question.
Let's take 2 more quick questions from Ambassador Franco and you can answer them together, please.
Thanks for being here and sharing this with us. The questions I have for Ambassador Franco would be the first. What does the European Union do for integration and to counter the phenomena of male immigrants dropping schools? The integration policy. I know the Dutch had the integratie policy for quite a long time and then it stopped with the change of government. So I was wondering how is it going on the European Union level? The second is, you mentioned in relation to the employers and their fear of appointing the immigrants, especially the 3rd generation immigrants who basically barely know their country of origin. What does the EU do when it comes to raising the awareness to those employers and business owners to employ more the immigrants living in the European Union countries? Thank you very much.
Chair, I have a couple of remarks. First of all, we should not forget in the early 90s, the initiative of President Kellis, the Prime Minister of Italy, who initiated the Mediterranean Forum, and who was, in my consideration, my opinion, was the father of all these developments. So this is point number one. Point number two, Ambassador Franco, I think the Europeans, or all this discussion is concentrated on what we have now, this moment. But I think if we look towards 10 or 15 years to come, I think the European societies are facing the problem of decreasing of the population, of aging, and so on. So you, at a certain moment, will need immigrants, we will need hand forces to use it in the economic field in the very near future, if we look towards 10 or 15 years to come. So I think you have to do more homework. I think you have to curb these trends of right wing that you have. You don't blame us for this. You have to do, as governments, you have to do your homework, and you have to do a lot about how to curb these trends which is against immigrants and against the xenophobia. And I mean, what happened in Europe in the 30s and 40s is not far away, and we should not let such trends to increase. And I know that there is in Holland, in your country, maybe in Austria, and so on, there are so many trends in this direction. So please, my point is you have to do more homework, you have to do internally, and not to blame us that immigrants are not integrated in society. So as to follow up the point, that you should also see why students are not going to schools, why they are not going to work, and so on. So, I mean, on both sides, we need to work hard, and you have to work internally hard. Thank you.
Good. The last question is it possible, Mr. Franco?
Question about the blue card that I recognize that one of the audience have asked it. My remark actually was also connected to the question of integration, because this is because I had a brief experience living in Belgium. I enjoyed it very much, but of course, I've always been intrigued how Canada was able to integrate immigrants while Europe failed miserably in history. Because I have had a lot of, I've attended many countless debates about this, and Canada actually are boasted, they are proud of their immigrants. Actually, the crime rates in Canada among the immigrants are far less than what you can call Canadians. I think Europe has to learn a lot from the Canadian experience. This is my remark. Apart from this, I enjoyed life in Belgium very much.
Let me just pick up this point about, I mean, I did not want to point any blaming or apportion any blame in this whole process. I mean, as I said, it's a supply and demand question, as economists would say. On the one hand, there is a reluctance to integrate and to do what society expects to do. On the other hand, there is a reluctance from employers to hire. But the example of the women proves that when they study, they can get jobs, and they can indeed fill the jobs for which at this moment they can really earn a decent living. It's not that they can't find, they study and they will find a job. It's absolutely right that the dependency ratios, as economists call it, over the years are going to deteriorate, in the sense that there are less and less people working for more and more people not working, that we need younger population, that we need labor force, that the increase in labor force is also a factor of growth. We need indeed a long-term policy to cope with these things. Now, to a large extent, these policies are not European policies, they're still national policies with European support. We have programs on the social fund, for instance, that do support these integration activities, but they can only be triggered off if the member state itself has a policy and applies for additional European support for this policy. The European Union does not intervene, I would say, on its own behalf with member states, or very rarely. There are a couple of examples, but most of these economic and social development policies are the European Union budget supporting initiatives taken by the member states. So I do agree with you that possibly we need perhaps a little bit more European steering, looking at the good examples, those countries that have been more successful than others, and trying to generalize the models, build on that, and show what can be done in order to facilitate integration, in order to use optimally the younger labor force that comes with the migration, and how it can be a factor in economic development, and in the medium and long term a factor also for the stability, the financial stability of society, because of course the weight of the pensions is going to become increasingly heavy in our society. And the I think it was you asked the question, this is an area which is full of contradictions. We cannot, what you can see as clear analytical reasoning doesn't necessarily square with what lives in society. There is education necessary, there is explaining necessary, there is, how shall I say, the public opinion is moving in the wrong direction. We have to bring public opinion back in the right direction. But you cannot do it by talking, you can only do it by doing, by showing examples how it can work, and how, with efforts on both sides, the municipalities and whatever, the employers, and on the other side, the migrant workers, how you can get to better understanding and to a better cooperation. There is a lot of work, and it is a time bomb that takes under our societies, and we have to stop the clock, right? And we don't have much time to stop the clock, because we have seen in previous years in some countries, that a little incident is enough to create a kind of a major conflict and fights between police and migrants and so on and so forth. A little detail is enough to light a powder keg and to have an explosion. We have seen it in some countries. We can have it in others. As I said, fortunately, Belgium, that's not too bad. In Antwerp, in all these years, I can remember one incident when a fool shot dead a Moroccan laborer, a local father, but the guy was a fool. He was mentally sick, and it was then the local community, the Muslim community, who took over. The imam said, "Calm down." But it took a day because there was fighting in the street, and windows being broken and cars being lighted, and then the imam came and said, "Stop it. Don't blame this on the community. This man is mentally sick. Everybody knows it," and it stopped. But a little incident sometimes is enough to have major consequences. So that's why I'm saying it's a time bomb, and we have to do something about it. Through constructive cooperation, to better preparation of migrants, to what has been said here in the first leg of the three-leg policy of the European Union. Facilitate legal migration and the integration of the legal migrants in our society. Again, it's a two-way process. It's those migrants that want to integrate and society that wants them to integrate. I think it's a huge task before us, where of course the relations between us and Southern Mediterranean and Euromed could of course also play a role at the international level.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. You started telling me you have to leave, but you're welcome to stay as long as you can. Thank you. I'm going to open.
Now all the questions for him now.
I'm going to open. I'm going to open the floor for questions. Let's start with Ambassador Abdel Latif, because he was given the rest. But before I do that, I want to the Ambassador of Sweden. Thank you, Ambassador. And the Ambassador of Lynn, sure. Thank you both for coming here.
I always thought it was very positive. I classified Sweden as one of the countries that had a very kind of open and constructive policy, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't seem to have paid off in public.
There are plus and minuses. I want to tell you.
Yes.
If I may, at some point.
In welcoming the Ambassador to Sweden, Ambassador from Romania, I'd like to start by saying if either of them wants to say anything on this subject or anything, then let's start with you and then we'll open it up to the rest. Ambassador? Yes?
Okay. Now Sweden is probably not a very interesting country for most of you because it's a very cold country far up in the north. By the way, I recognize my Polish colleague over there also. It's a country far up north. It's cold. It's dark. We're going towards the winter, etc. And we are only 9 million people. You may be amazed to hear that 14% of the population in Sweden were born abroad. And of them, approximately today, almost half of that part were born outside Europe. In the beginning of the 90s, we had 20,000 Muslims. Today, we have 450,000 Muslims. That may not sound high in your eyes, I mean, higher numbers, but it's from a very small number to 5% of the Swedish population, second largest religion in those years. Swedish healthcare system wouldn't survive without all the immigrants. It simply wouldn't survive. The doctor that treated me in the summer, his name was Ahmed Habib, he had origin in Germany. The Swedish the Deputy Minister of Education, her name is Nyamuku Sabuni. She was born in Burundi and came to Sweden when she was 14. The party secretary of the Social Democratic Party is Islam Bayram. He's a Kurd. He came to Sweden when he was 10 years old. He had never been to school. He had just been with goats before that. He's the party secretary of the largest party in Sweden. It's not a party in government. Now, these are some of the proofs, obviously. Some of the cons, I think you touched upon them, and when you say that it doesn't seem to have proven right, we had an election recently, we for the first time had an anti-immigration party. It had 5.7% of the votes. One effect of it is that you have never seen such expressions of anti-racist, anti-immigration, if that expression exists. Demonstrations, cooperation between parties in parliament that didn't cooperate before in order to counter them. So it might have something good along the line. But it's true that we now have them in parliament for the first time ever. They're extremely isolated, I would say. If I could point to a couple of key factors, I think that's what you said about education is extremely important. And what we see is that the girls tend to be educated, they really work with their education, they study very hard. I think you see the same tendency in Egypt, and basically you see that sort of all over the world. The tensions that do arise almost between young, uneducated boys of Swedish origin and young, uneducated boys of non-Swedish origin, predominantly non-European origin. There you see the tension. And consequently, the government, what it's trying to do is working with integration programs that bring in these people to society, but into education, into the workforce, etc. That's what is important, more important than sort of general migration policies. Labor policy, I would say that is the most important thing. And with that, the education policy. I think I've said enough. I mean, I'm trying to explain how the country is trying to counter that and how we're trying to work with all these issues on a very daily basis. But I can assure you that we do see the immigrants, also the ones from outside Europe, as a very important asset in our society. Can I add one thing? We have, there's sort of cities just south of Stockholm, a rather small one, a town rather, suburban type one. They have taken more Iraqis than the United States and Canada together during this, because we have 140,000 Iraqis in Sweden. So it's quite a high number. And I think I've explained to you once that the Swedish Prime Minister's origin is Latvian and American if you go very, very far back. So I mean, we are all a country of origin. My own is mentioned, by the way. They built the mines. We tried. It isn't easy.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to invite our Romanian ambassador to comment. I want to also welcome Ambassador Poland. I apologize for not reminding you you came in. And then the next questions will not be faculty, they'll be for students first, then we'll go back to the faculty and questions.
Thank you. I will be very short because Romania is in a particular situation. We became a European Union member just 3 years ago, January 1st, 2007. And our experience with the European Union is quite interesting. Of course, it is the benefit of my people, but one of the first, let's say, popular social movement we witnessed was that in a few months, 1 million Romanians emigrated to Spain and another 1 million to Italy. So our population decreased in a few months by 2 million, which is more or less 10% of the population. Why to Italy and why to Spain? Because the Romanian language is very close to the Spanish and Italian language. So Romania became a country of emigration to sister countries like Spain or Italy. But meantime, recently we are witnessing in Romania the other process. We need labor force. And we started, let's say, importing labor force from some Asian countries, including from Egypt in the construction sector. So it's once again this demand go for trade. And of course, for us it's a quite new experience. We are going to maybe to balance a little bit this situation. But I would like also to make a short reference to what Ambassador Marc Franco said at the beginning, the Roma problem with France. Roma is the gypsy population. So Romania, let's say, exported to Italy, to Spain, millions of people. We have now in France maybe 10,000 doctors from Romania working integrated in France, but several hundred gypsies there just returned now from France. They say voluntarily. Gypsies or Roma population is not easy to integrate. They need special conditions, and we hope that we'll have not only national efforts for them. We consider Roma, of course, Roma from Romania, because there are Roma from different other countries, Romanian citizens, but also European Union citizens. So there is an obligation not only for Romanian government, but also from European institutions to try to get involved in creating conditions for this population to be integrated, to be inserted economically and socially. It is not easy. Roma in Romania as a majority, we have, let's say, 1 million people, is integrated well in the society. But there are several thousand people, the so-called nomad Roma, which is practically impossible to settle them. So they travel. The French, of course, they returned several hundred recently, but be sure that many of them they will return or are already back in Paris or in other because you cannot settle. So my government, we've been in touch closely with the French government in order to change the mentality in approaching this Roma issue. We need to help them to integrate. First of all, of course, they should also have the will to integrate them, because we need to help them having jobs for the parents and educating the younger generation, which are the two things. I try to present the particular situation of my country as a new member of the European Union. Maybe from some points of view it's a country creating some problems for the European Union, but it's a learning experience for everybody. As a conclusion, I would say that my country will become more and more a country of economic emigration. We will need more and more specialized labor force in different areas, because that is the movement in Europe and in contact with other areas. And Egyptians, they are there in some areas, and I think the number will increase. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
And I would like, first of all, to start with myself. I came late the journey from Zamalek. It took me more than 1 hour. Anyhow, my message to you would be the same as what I said about 9 months ago to Ambassador Abdel Latif, that Poland is both a country of incoming immigrants and a country of people going abroad. We have, like Romania, about 2 million people working with other EU member states. It's 5% of our population went abroad during the last 5 years after we became a full member of the European Union. This phenomenon is a new thing in Poland because we were going abroad in the past, but not in such a great number. And the experiences from the last 5 years are such that in order to send people abroad or to let them travel abroad to find employment, there is a need for preparing those people, preparing in a very thorough and way that is well planned. And I think this is where we can find common interest, both countries on the southern Mediterranean and countries like Poland and Romania. We can exchange our experiences from this process that we went through before joining the EU and before starting to send our people to work in other member states. And this is what we offer to our Egyptian partners. Let's find ways, let's find means of exchanging those experiences, of seeing how we can, from our experiences, add to your instruments, your mechanism of preparing your people going to Europe.
And on enlargement and migration. This is the first enlargement, 2004 enlargement, that caused a major migration close to happen. The previous enlargement, of course, first began with the UK and Denmark and Ireland, and in the 70s, or with Greece, Spain and Portugal, or the countries, Sweden, Finland, Austria, did not create any migratory flows. And that's why, as a Commission, we were arguing with the member states to be extremely flexible with the transition period for labor. Because member states said, no, we have a transition period because there will be an inflow of labor. And our argument was historical experience showed that it's not the case. Now, in some countries, and indeed, I think, like the UK and Spain, popular countries were very flexible and did take very short or, in fact, no transition periods whatsoever for the free low labor. It turned out in this case it was different because, as you said, from Romania, many people migrated from Poland. I think Poland, the accountants and financial specialists in the city of London, to a large extent, are from Poland. And the UK had to stop at one point and be much more restricted. So it's, that could well have, let's say, contributed to the problems in old Europe. In this case, there was a very peculiar and very special situation where enlargement led to a migratory flow that was difficult to control.
Of course, it also creates a brain drain in original countries which we have to look at. But let's start with 3 questions, if there are from the students, please.
Its way through this panel. There was a discussion about this disenfranchised male population in some countries. I know that at the very beginning you were talking about one of the baskets of this was a cultural one. That while countries such as Sweden, Brussels, and Poland have the responsibility to maintain order, is it a responsibility of the countries of origin to try and facilitate assimilation between those immigrants with the Polish, Belgian, and Swedish population, or whether it's easier for those countries where the immigrants have landed, those governments take care of it. Sorry if I haven't been clear.
Any other questions from students first? Yes, very much.
Greetings, ambassadors. My name is Marc Franco, and I'm a graduate student in migration and refugee studies. There was mention of the Roma people, and I had a question about that because I think sometimes when we discuss about certain groups of people who are living within the state or a nation state, I haven't seen or read much material that really has talked about ways in which we have been able to negotiate with those persons who have different perceptions of mobility and of living within a state that or environment does not necessarily accommodate to how they see their forms of movement from a cultural setting. So I was wanting to know, one, if you're looking at Roma people in wherever areas in Europe, have you been met with a lot of resistance in regards to a lot of them not necessarily wanting to stay inside the constrictions of the nation state? And two, what has been done to kind of negotiate with it? If there have been any restrictions that have occurred?
Okay, a last question, from faculty, right?
Relating to illegal migration and the role of the European Union and the Mediterranean countries to deal with illegal migration. According to my humble opinion, it's not a matter just of procedure. For example, it's not just a matter of the government of Egypt helping get back those immigrants and policing mechanism. It's more than that, how to shift from push country into a pull country, how to make the environment here more conducive so that we don't have so many young graduates risking their lives and drowning in order to reach the shores of Greece and Italy, and then we're just trying to get them back and saying we're doing our job. On the other side, the Europeans, it's also not a matter of procedures, but more about invigorating their development cooperation programs. The more we help the developing world into becoming more capable of absorbing its youth and creating jobs for them, the more there is, or the less there is likelihood that illegal migration will continue and we will all suffer from it.
Thank you. I'll begin with the last question. I mentioned answering Ambassador Nabil that migration, I will answer only one. Men and women in education and so on. This is not a phenomenon correctly expressed. Because correctly expressed, it means, first of all, I will say that even on the French society, for instance, in schools, it's the same thing. Here we have the supremacy of gender, of women, because they have a problem with also the students, men students. So, number one. Number two, delinquency is becoming a major phenomenon in Europe. Not migrants, but delinquency in the societies. And the strategy, it has been mentioned concerning the Stockholm Program and Action Plan, delinquency is one of the main problems in general. Number three, why this gentleman don't go to school? Because they don't want to go to school. Or there are reasons for that. There must be. It's not a directive. Directives are there for integration. I have no doubt about it. But there is on the ground problems and challenges that maybe need from your side and maybe for the organization of migrants. So, but it is when a gentleman called Muhammad and he goes to a lawyer and his name is Muhammad, immediately there is not ever of that, but there is the stereotype that even
Fatma gets the job. Fatma gets the job.
Fatma gets a job. Why? Because she is considered a woman, and you have here, because there is also, according to the laws, he has to fulfill the gender parity or so. Number two, in Sweden, which was a country of immigration from late 90s and beginning of 20s, they were very open to migrants in the 70s. My son was sent to a kindergarten, and one of the integration, or at least be stranger with the environment, there was a social worker coming specially every day, speaking in Arabic because he didn't speak Swedish in the first course. And she stayed daily with him for a month until he switched, not he switched, but he understood English and he could integrate. This is not any, it is there, but it is not in all countries. When somebody said here, should we begin the assimilation here or there? I mean, it is there, and we have asked many European countries, the police who is dealing with migrants, social workers who are dealing with migrants, education of professors, media people, they need to have also an education on how to understand the migrant is there and try to, and we said we are ready to cooperate on that because this is important. So this is around the money to say about the money. Okay, thank you. Yes, you can. Yeah, we'll come then. So to answer Dr. Laila, when I said, Ambassador Nabil asked me, when I said about great migration and development, I said it's not only remittances, because what the European and international has done is now to concentrate on remittances. But we said that development is much more than that. Development is development projects, it's training, and there is homework to be done by countries of origin in the socio-economic development of the country. Okay? We are not going to wait for them to, they can contribute, they can support. But we have to cooperate in fighting illegal migration. Why? Because all the Europeans think that everybody is going there to stay forever. So there is, if you want to build confidence, it's not we're going to making police against our migrants. It's much better for them and to cooperate to bring them back here. Why? Because if not then, they could be subject to any organized crime, to have not, it will have socio-economic problems. So it is only an instrument of, but we are against massive readmission, not accepted, and it has to be done with all the human dimension and human rights to be respected. But you cannot just ignore and not to deal with the illegal migration. And you have to develop.
In parallel to other...
In parallel, of course. I mean, that's why there is, we say when we deal migration, the Europeans were dealing with migration on the security dimension only until now. But they had another speech last few years, since 2005, they call it, what we have asked for years, the global approach. Global approach is the three in a balanced way, in a parallel way, in a comprehensive way. Legal and legal development.
Okay, our last set of questions, a few more questions.
No, I have a question to you, but before that I want to, I'm very glad that you dealt with the question of education outcomes, because they have to be analyzed. Why are education outcomes? But I think it should also be said that we should pay tribute to the Swedish policy of migration. Sweden has started a policy at the end of 2008. It is employer started, and it is working quite well. It is a very liberal policy, and it's a policy which is working quite well. And by the way, it was started by not a left-wing government, by a right-wing government. And yet it is...
the Social Democrats...
Yeah, but it's a liberal. It's a liberal.
It's a liberal. It's not
but it is quite interesting, and I think it is worth being studied, because I think many European countries can learn from the example. Now, my question to you, what are the political problems faced by the European for the Mediterranean, the Union for the Mediterranean? Yes, no, because we all know that there are problems that are faced by the Union for the Mediterranean.
This answer, Ambassador Nabil will answer, because he's better than now. Okay, but I want to ask the Ambassador of Sweden, why this uprising of a right or ultra-right-wing party, despite that Sweden has been during decades, at least 40, at the forefront of this integration, of accepting and integrating. So why an anti-migration? Due to the migrants themselves? or due to culture, or to fears, or to... Why?
You were in Sweden in the 70s.
Yes.
You probably will not recognize very much in Sweden today because it's different for many different reasons. I think we talk about all European countries changing very rapidly. The labor markets, the whole, basically Sweden is not today any longer a country of industrial workers. It's a country of people who are either civil servants or in the service sector. The industry is being done much more cheaply in Korea, in Vietnam, in Malaysia, in India, China, etc. So it's a different kind of country. And it's also a country where obviously you need much more education, you need much more entrepreneurship. I mean, previously it was large conglomerates, it was Volvo and SKF and all these companies that you're familiar with, I think, that were employing people. That's no longer the case. So that is, I think, an enormous change that has happened. That means that very many town cities, sort of in between, and also very many people in the rural area have been heavily affected by that. We see places all over the country where there's mass unemployment. And mass unemployment creates fear, creates, this risk, do I have to move? And again, this pattern is very obvious. The young women, they study, and then they move as quickly as possible. The young men, they stay on. They're among these people that wait for the old society to come back. And this has to do very much with the labor market, but they associate it with a Sweden that was blonde and blue-eyed and all those things, and think it is because of the migrants that this has happened. But the change that is taking place in Sweden and many other European countries is much more fundamental and requires education. And that, I think, is why the key issue is about those two things and about being prepared for a different kind of society.
Thank you, Professor. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, Chief. This is the last question, and we'll close.
I'm sorry for avoiding. So I didn't mean to ask that question. What I meant to bring attention to is I'm Irish, and with Irish immigration to the United States, the consulates general take a big role in shaping how that experience is. So I was asking whether you think it would be a benefit, like is a situation similar, that should the Egyptian consuls, the Libyan consuls, take an increased effort in shaping the immigrant experience for second generations in European countries, or whether it would be a point.
I will tell you about my own experience. Maybe I would not like it, but this was my experience. I was in Gaza, I was not in the consul general. And I have been asked several times by our people to establish a school where all the education curricula will be in Arabic. I refused. I said, if you want to stay in this country, you have to learn Italian and to go to an Italian school, to mix with Italian. Otherwise, if you are in an Arab, and there was a Libyan school, only Arabic. There was an Iraqi school, only Arabic. But this was for diplomats and foreigners working in the FAO or the WFP. They were leaving, most of them. But what you can ask me is, in Italian school, you will have the opportunity to learn Arabic. Muslim or Islamic culture, this is not, because it is in the European societies, it's not for all schools and it's not, so it's, you have cultural centers and so on. But Arabic, yes, this is what I can push for. So this is one an effort or my concept of helping them to integrate. Because they put a wrong there. It doesn't mean they will lose their identity. Not. Because we are there with our cultural activities, we have the cultural academy, we have the cultural center and so on. So there are. Secondly, they have also, now with the satellite, they have the programs and so on, and we have with the parents going on. But they have to be with Italians. And by the first generation, the second, third generation becoming more difficult. But I was attacked and criticized because that means you want them to become Italians. Italians in the United States of America, after 100 years, they're still Italians with an American mentality, but they have the whole tradition. They're not mafiosi, most of them, but they still kept the characteristic of an Italian. You can still distinguish an Italian American, or an American Italian, an American Polish, or an American Greek, or an American Irish. So, I mean, this is what we can do. But also, the host country has a lot to do. As I said, social workers, professors, teachers in schools, they have to be educated about the migrants, if there is Arab or African and so on. Police officers, which is very important. Media people. And this is the most dangerous instrument of racism and anti-migrant feeling in a country. Because there are stereotypes that are disseminated in propagated in the TV programs. My wife was asked to go to a program, a talk show for 10 minutes to speak about women in Egypt. The press officer arranged for the meeting, and she went there. It was on the air, it was live. So I switched on the TV, and I found my wife sitting there, and behind her, a burqa woman from Afghanistan. So immediately, it was given the wrong message. Burqa is not in Egypt, and we are talking about Egypt. But the gentleman who organized this, so I called the press officer, I told her to stop, and my wife will not speak in this talk show, or they have to remove this lady who's behind her. They will. So you see, I mean, sometimes there is misconception. But here we have to work together with the media. It's very important also to ask it, to have integration. Thank you. About the uniform training, there are
Well, thank you, Professor Abdel Latif. You started off as a diplomat, you ended also as a diplomat, but I also want to thank Mr. Franco, although he's not here. I think between the beginning and the end, we had a very clear and candid discussion, which I think is useful to all of us, our hesitancy. I want to thank everybody from the community who's come here today, and the students and the faculty. I hope it's useful. We will try to alternate some of our events, some downtown, some here, so we don't ask you all to come up here, but we have an obligation to showcase the campus. Thank you very much. There are some questions at the back.
Thank you.
So you don't get too hungry on your way back.
Thank you, Pastor. Thank you.